Buffalo Grass by Joseph Marshall from The Dance House. Growing up on the northern plains, I thought that all the world was a wide expanse of endless prairies and rolling hills. I couldn't imagine the world being anything but beckoning open spaces, bright sunrises, and spectacular sunsets, booming, crackling thunderstorms that petrified the mind and invigorated the spirit. I couldn't picture a world that didn't know the meadowlark's song, a place where the wind didn't dance with the grasses. And if there were such a place, it would never know my footsteps. If there were such a place, surely no one lived there. My love for the plains, my loyalty to them was engendered by the stories my grandparents told because they and their stories were connected to what the plains were and are: vast, grassy, hot, dry, windy, peaceful, turbulent, cold, wet, muddy, dusty, ghostly, and motherly. The plains were the only home they ever knew in their lives, and the one I return to as often as I can, and it is where I will rest when my sojourn in this world is ended. I have seen the world from mountain tops, such as the Gorno Alto region in western Siberia and the bighorns of the Powder River country in north central Wyoming. On the Mojave Desert, I stood and watched heat rise in shimmering prism waves. Once I helped a friend build an igloo out of snow in the frozen North Country and spent a few nights in it. Weaving my way through a dense forest of pine, I nearly panicked because there were no horizons to center me. Trekking through a dense tropical jungle, I did panic when I couldn't see the sky, only a canopy of green. There was no panic when I played along the seashore with my youngest daughter, perhaps because of the open expanse of Puget Sound. But in all those places, I always made a comparison to my home ground. There is natural beauty everywhere, to be sure. Each kind of terrain, each kind of topography and ecology is unique. But the plains, especially the northern plains, are in my heart and in my blood as unique and beautiful as other wild places are. They will never compare to the plains. The plains made me a wanderer long before I was born. One only needs to know the plains to know why and how. From the top of one hill, I would wonder what was beyond the next highest hill I could see in the distance. And from that hill, there was always another and another. They all beckoned to come and look. In between the hills were creeks and dry watercourses, gullies, oak and cottonwood groves, chokecherry and buffalo berry shrubs, open meadows, deer, coyotes, rabbits, quail, and butterflies. In between the hills was adventure. Each adventure wove its way into my memory, just as the land and everything, every being that was part of it embedded itself into my heart and connected with the heritage that flowed in my veins. After all, I do come from a long line of wanderers. The natural environment created the indigenous human cultures of the Turtle Island on the basis of one simple yet profound lesson: adapt or perish. Anyone who lived on the plains had to be a wanderer or risk death and loneliness. Of course, that was in the time when some humans understood that they had to move with the flow of everything around them. Why, I can recall asking my grandparents, did the people move around so much? Because everything else did, was always the reply. The influence of nature affected everything: dwellings, clothing, language, lifestyle, diet, spiritual beliefs and practices, and more. No matter where people lived, different human cultures evolved because the land was different. Life in the mountains was different from life on the seacoasts or around the Great Lakes, or the great forests, or the deserts, or the plains. But no matter how many different human cultures there were, they all shared one essential precept: they adapted themselves to fit the natural environment. It is difficult to know how many peoples came from the plains in the dim and distant past. Some came of their own accord, others were driven from some other place by change or catastrophe. They all came looking for something, life mostly. Some only passed through, and some stayed. Some stayed briefly, and some for generations. Some of us are still here. But no one came because they wanted to be wanderers. The land and everything and everyone who was part of the plains taught them to be wanderers. The greatest wanderer on the plains was Tatanka, the bison, more commonly known as buffalo. Tatanka was literally and figuratively the primary source of life for the indigenous people who came and stayed on the plains. To take advantage of what Tatanka had to offer, the people had to follow the great herds. Thus, they became wanderers in order to live. The buffalo were plentiful. Estimates of their numbers west of the Mississippi River are in the millions, often as high as 60 million, 240 million hooves. And if, on the average, each adult grew to weigh a ton, it's no small wonder that the earth shook when they galloped. 120 billion pounds on the hoof must have shaken the rafters on the sky itself. Why then did the buffalo wander? Perhaps mainly because they could. There are very few things that can stop a single 2,000-pound animal, much less a herd of them. I'm convinced that wandering was in the buffalo blood long before humans came to Turtle Island. I hear they originated in northern Europe, and I did see their relatives on a farm in Sweden 3 years ago. Same color, same build, same size, but a little taller at the hip. They are said to have migrated across Asia and then across Beringia to Turtle Island. Once a wanderer, always a wanderer. On Turtle Island, the buffalo found the ideal home on the plains stretching from what is now central Texas northward to what is now Alberta and Manitoba. Short grass prairie in the west and tall grass prairie in the east. But most of all, open spaces. Of course, other grazing animals lived on the plains as well: elk, antelope, and deer, but their numbers combined probably didn't match the buffalo. All of them, of course, were nurtured and sheltered by the land. When indigenous man finally came to the plains, he saw that the environment offered all that he could ever need and want for survival. Sooner or later, the buffalo became the primary source of food, shelter, and clothing. One story of the Great Plains prior to the coming of European man is primarily the story of the interrelationship between indigenous man and the buffalo. Indigenous man became and remained dependent on the buffalo, to the point that the dependence became his weakness in the eyes of European man. To weaken and defeat indigenous man, European man eventually annihilated the buffalo, but prior to that, both the buffalo and the indigenous man flourished. There was more than enough buffalo to feed, shelter, and house all of the population of the Great Plains, because humans probably never numbered more than 0.5% of the buffalo population. Non-Indian anthropologists and others love to talk about the development of the buffalo cultures of the plains, but some of them link the evolvement of buffalo cultures to the horse. Of course, the modern horse was brought to Turtle Island by European man. The not so subtle implication here is that European man was somehow responsible for creating the buffalo cultures, because the horse enabled indigenous man to hunt the buffalo. This short-sightedness ignores the fact that man was hunting buffalo on foot long before European man arrived. Furthermore, the Plains people continued to use different methods of hunting buffalo after the horse arrived. The point is, buffalo cultures were in place long before the horse was brought to Turtle Island. Anyone who knows something about pre-European human cultures on the plains knows about buffalo jumps, drop-offs, or cliffs over which buffalo were chased and fell to their death. That is the most widely known method of buffalo hunting prior to horse-mounted chases. Other popular methods involved wolves, snow, and practicality. One or two wolves were not considered a significant threat to a herd of buffalo. Both the buffalo and the wolves knew that. So did indigenous man. Therefore, by draping a wolf hide over his body, a single hunter, or sometimes two, could crawl on hands and knees to within easy bow shot of a small herd. When the right opportunity presented itself, the hunter loosed several arrows into one animal and crawled away to wait for the stricken buffalo to die from bleeding. Hunting was not a seasonal sport, of course. It was done year-round. Winter hunting on the plains was the most difficult for the obvious reasons of cold and snow. But deep snow became an ally of indigenous man after he figured out how to make snowshoes to keep him from sinking in. On the other hand, the buffalo's great weight was a liability in deep snow. Small groups of hunters on snowshoes would look for buffalo, digging for browse in sheltered areas, then drive them into deep snow. As the buffalo floundered, their size and speed were neutralized, and the hunters would move in with bows and arrows. A few daring ones moved in close enough to use a lance. Another effective year-round method was the ambush. Pits were dug or blinds were built along known buffalo routes. The hunter or hunters would hide and wait for a close shot at a passing animal, letting it quarter away from him for the best shot. The horse, therefore, was not an instrument of change. It was a tool to enhance an already existing lifestyle. Most of the indigenous tribes of the plains were nomads, wanderers, before the horse came. The horse simply enabled them to travel farther and faster and carry big loads. The buffalo cultures were more than indigenous man's material dependence on the buffalo. But because he was grateful for all that the buffalo provided, he gave the buffalo the only thing he could, respect. For the sake of practicality, indigenous man's respect for the buffalo led him to utilize everything the buffalo had to offer. Little, if anything, was wasted. The trademark of the Plains tribes, the conical lodge, was made of 20 to 25 scraped and treated buffalo hides. With the winter hair left on and tanned on the other side, they were the warm winter robes. The hair was twisted into cordage, ropes, and tie-downs to help secure the lodge, and for reins, jaw ropes, and war bridles for the horses. Hooves were boiled to make glue. Bones were used for toys, utensils, weapons, and sled runners. Horns were fashioned into cups, ladles, and spoons. The tips were used to make necklaces. Sinew, both backstrap and hamstring, was used as bowstrings and fletching wrap on arrows. The list goes on and on. As a symbolic gesture of respect, a buffalo skull was placed to face the east to greet the rising sun each day. And of course, the buffalo is given significant roles in origin stories. According to one Lakota story, the Lakota at one time lived underground beneath the Pahasapa, the Black Hills. They were enticed to go above ground, and so they emerged from a cave. But once they had emerged, they could not return. A leader stayed underground, however, because he foresaw hardship for the people. When that hardship did occur, he sacrificed his own safety and emerged into earth in the form of a buffalo. And of course, the buffalo became the source for all the necessities of life for the Lakota, enabling them to live through the hardships and become prosperous. A more well-known story is about the white buffalo calf maiden. Because of hardships faced by the people, a female white buffalo appeared in the form of a beautiful woman and brought sacred ceremonies to the people. She taught them the ceremonies and left. Leaving, she walked into a mist and reappeared on the other side as a white buffalo. Sitting on the fringes of a conversation among old Lakota men, once when I was a boy, I heard a story that is one of my favorites. It was a story of an actual occurrence. That conversation, as I recall, was about the old life before the reservation, when the Lakota still lived on the land and moved with the seasons. It was about a time when there were still wolves and bears in what is now south central South Dakota, and of course many, many buffalo. Two rivers meet in that part of the country, and they are now known as the Big White and Little White Rivers. The old men who told the story called the Big White the White Earth River, and the Little White the Smoking Earth River. The Smoking Earth and Little White River flows into the Big White Earth River, which in turn flows into the Big Muddy or Missouri River. At the confluence of the Smoking Earth and White Earth Rivers was a trading site. Early French traders traveled up from the Big Muddy with their trade goods, and the Lakota who were inclined to trade traveled from their various encampments and pitched their lodges at the trading site. One such group was on a high ridge overlooking the confluence, waiting for a large buffalo herd to pass. The herd was traveling to the northeast. Suddenly, another large herd came from the northwest, heading in a southeasterly direction. The two herds met at a crossing just west of the confluence, and each herd was strung out for 2 to 3 miles, according to the storytellers. The Lakota travelers on the ridge watched as the two herds met, expecting to see some confusion as the herds began to mingle. The animals crossed the river leisurely, dropped their great heads to water, and then moved on. There was no confusion. Instead, the two herds crisscrossed each other and eventually continued on their individual courses, one to the southeast and the other to the northeast. This took place in the early 1800s, and the story was handed down from the Lakota travelers who witnessed the occurrence. The buffalo, and to a lesser degree elk, deer, and antelope, provided for the physical and spiritual survival of the people of the plains, like the Lakota. What then did the buffalo survive on? Obviously, their requirements for survival were provided by the resources of the plains, otherwise they would not have flourished. Forage in the form of several kinds of grasses was plentiful on the plains, such as chufa, sedge, cotton grass, spike grass, reed grass, June grass, needlegrass, grama, and of course buffalo grass. Strangely enough, buffalo grass was not as widespread as some of the other types of forage. It is a short grass still found in a narrow corridor from Texas to Canada. That seems to coincide with the geographical boundaries of the Great Plains. Buffalo grass was important forage for buffalo, but not exclusively as the name might suggest. But however the name came about, it does suggest a unique symbiotic relationship between it and its namesake. One Lakota word for buffalo grass is peji iwichako yake, or grass that catches. The name was applied because of the creeping runners just beneath the soil surface between main stalks or clumps. Someone walking would often catch their toe on the runners, thus the name, and that someone walking could be man or animal. This characteristic meant survival for the grass and was the basis for the relationship between it and the buffalo. Buffalo roamed in large and small herds, and they were especially active from mid-spring to early autumn, the period when buffalo grass flourished. To be sure, buffalo ate buffalo grass, but they also helped replant. The front animals in large herds moving swiftly would knock down seeds, and the ones coming behind would push them into the ground. It is interesting to note that buffalo grass was plentiful on the open prairies of the Great Plains, in the area with the largest concentrations of buffalo. Buffalo grass hardly grows anywhere else on the continent. I would suggest, however, unscientifically, that though buffalo grass is still found on the Great Plains, it is not nearly as plentiful as when buffalo roamed the land by the millions. In fact, it grew so thick that early white settlers took advantage of its soil binding properties by cutting it into slabs to make sod houses. The other reason buffalo grass and buffalo are not as plentiful as they once were is that modern man has taken over much of their space. Roads, towns, and cities proliferate, obliterating the migratory routes of the buffalo. Whatever open grazing land remains is set aside for domesticated cattle and sheep. Cultivated crops have shouldered aside the native flora in much the same way indigenous people were overwhelmed by the larger European and Euro-American population. Right or wrong, destiny or coincidence, change is a part of life, and it is no more or less true for all who were a part of the Great Plains, including the land itself. But change on the plains has moved at a swifter, faster pace in the last 300 years than it had in the previous few thousand years. 25 million people now call the plains home, and buffalo number less than 1% of the human population. They are feared by cattle producers because they are brucellosis carriers, a disease which can cause spontaneous abortion in domestic cattle. The fear is so great that buffalo wandering out of the boundaries of Yellowstone National Park are summarily shot. It's doubtful that the buffalo killers remember that domesticated cattle infected buffalo with brucellosis. Perhaps some effort should be put forth to determine why buffalo are not as radically affected by the disease. Perhaps killing buffalo is too ingrained in the Euro American mind, or perhaps some may think that the act of killing is the only answer. The plains will never be the same, which of course is the first law of change. Nothing remains the same. Wolves no longer inhabit the plains because they were victims of unfounded fears, and the knee jerk reaction to eradicate the fears was to eradicate the wolf. Grizzly bears are gone from the plains too, partly due to extirpation, but mostly because of loss of habitat. Towns, farms, ranches, and roads invaded their territory, and people became too numerous. We indigenous peoples are still here, but our populations had to rebound from the brink of extinction. Around 1900, our total population in the United States was just over 200,000, lower than the indigenous plains population alone at the moment of first contact with European man. Estimates of our total North American population around 1500 AD range from 3 to 10 million. Fortunately, those of us on the plains seem to be as resilient as buffalo grass. Hunting was the predominant source of survival and livelihood on the plains prior to European man's arrival. Agriculture has taken its place now, and hunting is a seasonal sport. In fact, the Great Plains are now referred to as the breadbasket in Joel Garrou's 1981 book, The Nine Nations of North America. Ironically, the farming lifestyle, so detested and resisted by the nomadic hunting tribes, now prevails. The cycles of nature still come and go, however. The lightning still flashes, the thunder still booms, blizzards still howl across the landscape, meadowlarks still sing, and the wind still dances with the grass. Against all odds, the natural environment of the plains remains true to itself, in spite of the fact that the new humans who inhabit it are not as adaptive as they are manipulative. We have forgotten the adapt or perish edict of an endeavor to change the land to fit our wants, our needs, and our whims. Farm to market roads, hydroelectric dams, flood walls, and recreation areas, for example. There are still wanderers of sorts, but they crisscross the land on paved roads, riding inside climate controlled conveyances, hardly ever stopping to feel the soil, touch the grass, or feel the wind on their faces. The Great Plains will outlive us two leggeds, as it always has. I pray that it can overcome the scars we have left due to our arrogance and disrespect. After all, we nearly killed the land once by plowing it so much that we stripped it faster than it could renew itself. The winds came and turned the world into clouds of dust, trying to remind us that technology and industry are not the same as wisdom. The great rivers of the plains flooded recently, reminding us of the awesome power of the natural environment. Some of us were outraged and insulted at and amidst the subsequent wailing were the catchphrases, the ravages of nature, nature's cruelty, and battling the elements. We measured our losses in terms of millions and billions of dollars and vowed to rebuild, to dig in, to build stronger retaining walls so that the next time nature oversteps its bounds, we can put up a better fight. But why fight? Why do we insist on characterizing our relationship with nature as a contest? Perhaps because we consider ourselves as being apart from it and on a higher level. As long as we continue to think that way, the natural environment will continue to whip our butts. The Great Plains have changed because, if nothing else, we have multiplied alarmingly. But along with that, we have largely forgotten how to adapt to the land. We continue to build homes and towns in floodplains. We overplow, overplant, and overgraze. Our arrogance leads us to think that nature's Nature sends tornadoes, floods, and blizzards exclusively to bedevil us. Damages from such natural occurrences are measured in terms of how humans are affected. We seldom consider that wild or domestic animals are also injured or killed, or that trees uprooted in a storm will die, or that the earth, rivers, lakes, and streams are also affected. The arrogance is equaled only by its narrow scope. Our hold on the plains will remain as it is because we think that change is only a forward motion. We become indignant at the thought of going back because we think in terms of improvement and less often of restoration. I can recall the angry outcries of some years ago when it was suggested that public lands should be used to restore the buffalo to the plains. We are more likely to put up new fences than tear down old ones because we define the land as commodity, not as a living entity. We are reluctant to consider that the wisdom of the past helped the indigenous people to adapt to the land, to move with its rhythms and cycles instead of competing with it. It is a lesson we don't want to consider because it seems to mean going backward. That attitude prevents us from realizing that moving with the natural environment is really a step forward. If we take the responsibility to see to it that the land will endure and survive, we are ensuring our own survival. Whatever our culture, those of us who are from the plains or have lived there are profoundly affected by them. We are either in love with the open spaces or we consider them empty. Rarely is there ambivalence, as has always been the case. Some of us belong on the plains and some of us don't. But the factors which now bring us here, keep us here, or cause us to leave are often not directly related to the natural environment. More than likely, they are money or career, and that turns out to be a losing situation for us and the environment. Whatever it is that prevents us from having a close, profound relationship with the natural plains or the environment of any culture area creates an artificial, often superficial buffer that manipulates us into thinking of ourselves as more important than the environment. We are part of a whole, not an entity apart from it. The plains no longer shudder from the thunder of millions of buffalo, yet the land is still alive, and it will endure all the insults we have managed to heap upon it. Whatever we have done to it, there is one final reality. In the end, it will claim us all. Some of us will feel a welcome embrace, and some of us will only feel the cold. The end.